Welcome to this week's edition of Social Studies Distance Learning. We're still learning about causes for the American Revolutionary War. This week's lesson may take you the entire week to finish or maybe over the course of a few days. Either way, take your time because there's a lot of things that I need you to accomplish. You will need a paper and pencil towards the end of the assignment. First, I need you to watch this video about the Quartering Act of 1765 from King George III. Now watch this short video about the Townshend Act of 1767 from King George III. This is a magazine article that I found and I want to share with you this week for our social studies distance learning. No taxation without representation. Take a look at the caption first. I always like to look at the captions first. These are images of the Stamp Act. They decreed or said that American colonists had to pay for a stamp to be applied to most paper products. We learned about that last week. I'm starting right up here. Great Britain's victory over France in the French and Indian War, 1755 to 1763, came at a cost. The war was expensive and Britain's national debt had nearly doubled during the conflict. King George III and Parliament needed a source of revenue to pay off the debt. One solution was to impose new taxes on the American colonies. The members of Parliament didn't think it was too unreasonable. And after all, the colonists were British citizens and had benefited from Britain's success in the war. Decades earlier, in 1733, Great Britain had attempted to tax colonies with the Molasses Act. The act placed a tax of 6 pence per gallon of imported molasses. British tax collectors had a difficult time enforcing the law. The colonists had resisted or avoided paying the tax. And when the colonial merchants found ways to smuggle in molasses and other products from the French West Indies, British merchants lost revenue. I'm right here right now if you lost your place. So in 1764, Great Britain tried again. It passed the Sugar Act. The act reduced the molasses act tax, that's a mouthful, to 3 pence per gallon. It made clear, however, that the collection of the tax would be enforced. It authorized stiff penalties for the smuggling of sugar and molasses. Dozens of new custom collectors began to inspect the American cargoes and enforce the law. Parliament didn't understand that the colonists were experiencing economic hardships too. Trade was declining just as customs enforcements grew. Individual colonies had grown, I don't know, the word is covered, their own debt to finance the French and Indian War. Local taxes remained high. I'm right here now. Then Parliament passed 2 more laws in 1765. This is what we haven't learned about yet. The Quartering Act, and it's right here, it means to provide housing. It demanded that the colonists quarter and feed the troops stationed in North America as part of their contribution to the empire. I'm thinking right now, I hope I don't get anybody who eats too much. How will I afford to feed them? Or takes my bed. How will I want to quarter them? Paul Revere actually plays a good part in this, and I'll talk to you about that later. The Stamp Act decreed that most printed documents, such as wills, mortgages, newspapers, calendars, and playing cards, bear a stamp that had to be purchased by the colonists. It was a common tax in Great Britain. Parliament intended it to be used entirely to support British troops defending North America. As one member of Parliament said, if America looks to Great Britain for protection, she must enable us to protect her. If she expects our fleets, she must assist our revenue. Revenue is money made. Reaction to the Stamp Act in the colonies was immediate. For the first time in over 150 years, colonists found themselves being taxed directly to raise money instead of paying an indirect tax on goods to regulate trade. Outraged Americans also protested their lack of representation in Parliament. Huge phrase. Boston lawyer James Otis declared it absolutely irreconcilable with the colonists' rights as British subjects. He claimed that taxation without representation is tyranny. This is a very, very famous phrase right here. Other colonial leaders agreed. They believed that the situation could open the door to more taxes and even political oppression. In May 1765, Patrick Henry introduced a series of resolutions in the Virginia's House of Burgesses. He claimed that only a colony's local assembly, not Parliament, had the power to lay and collect taxes on colonists. In fifth grade speak, it means that only the colonies can tax the colonies, not British. The king imposing taxes on the colonies. So what happens? Well, rioting broke out in several colonies. In October 1765, delegates from 9 colonies met in New York as the Stamp Act Congress. They petitioned the king to repeal the act. They also encouraged colonists to boycott British goods. In fifth grade speak, they had an assembly that they wrote a letter to the king to telling him to take back the act. And they boycotted it, meaning that they would not purchase any of those goods. Those efforts were successful, and when the Stamp Act took effect in November 1, 1765, there was nobody to enforce it. Take a look here at the caption. This is a secondary resource of the colonists' angry reaction to the Stamp Act of 1765. It surprised the British government. And I like these images right here. Here we have molasses, we have sugar, and we have loose leaf tea. It comes in a bag nowadays, but you can also, if you have a K-cup, it's loose leaf. This is the molasses, the sugar, the tea. And the colonists enjoyed and imported them until the British began to tax them. And I'm going to read this last sentence right here. The men appointed to collect the stamp revenues were persuaded or forced to resign, and Parliament, that's the British government over there in Britain, recognized that the British merchants were being harmed. The act was repealed in 1766. I'm right here. Yet most members of Parliament believed the act to be constitutional or fair, and they were determined to check the colonies. Parliament also passed the Declaratory Act in 1766. That act asserted or gave Parliament control over the governance of the colonies in all cases whatsoever. It did not mention taxes specifically, but the colonists were not sure that the issues of taxes had been resolved. Fifth grade speak, right here. That means Parliament in Britain is saying, you know what, we have control over these colonies. I don't know who these colonists think they are. But then Parliament passed a series of acts in 1767. This is where the tea gets good, no pun intended. The Townshend Acts were new taxes on imported goods, including glass, paper, and tea. You need glass, paper, and tea to live, people. Once again, the colonists resisted. They harassed or threatened the collectors. They turned to smuggling to avoid paying the taxes. Those of you who said in the past you'd be smugglers, now's your time. As a town meeting in Boston in 1768, Sam Adams, right here, offered resolutions denying Parliament's right to tax the colonies without their consent. In other words, in fifth grade speak, right here, Sam Adams is saying, no, Britain, you are not, Parliament is the government in Britain, you are not taxing these colonists. We're going to figure out a way to fix that. The resolutions were sent to the other colonies with the call for united action against Great Britain. And take a look here, this is the caption. On the left, right here, that's Virginian Patrick Henry. This is a secondary resource. He was one of the first colonists to speak against the Stamp Acts, and this is Sam Adams, also encouraging his fellow Massachusetts residents to resist Great Britain's effort to tax them. Boycotting. Those of you who don't want to buy a service or a product, that's what you do, you boycott. I always get distracted by the pictures. Colonists dressed as Native Americans who threw tea into the Boston Harbor in what became known as the Boston Tea Party. This is one of my favorite events that lead to the Revolutionary War. So I'm right here, I'm starting to read right here. Within a couple of years, the boycott of goods again took its toll on British merchants. Parliament accepted a partial repeal of the Townshend Acts, but a tax on tea remained in place. Remember, English people, British people, colonists, loved their tea. Coffee was not as popular then. I'm right here starting to read. In 1773, Britain passed yet another tax, the Tea Act. It was not only a new tax, but it provided a way for the East India Company to sell its tea cheaply to the colonies. It offered the struggling company a way to regain a monopoly, and a monopoly is like the only one, like the game, like you want to be the only one in charge. So it offered the struggling company a way to gain a monopoly on tea in America while also undercutting the trade for colonial merchants, meaning that the East India Company would get all the money and the American merchants would be out of luck. They would be poorer. Colonists feared that the act would lead to British monopolies on other goods. Remember, glass and paper are very important there too. They organized a general boycott of imported British goods. A few colonies would not allow the ships carrying East India Company tea to land. They sent the ships back to Great Britain, and then, I feel like there should be a drum roll here. In the fall of 1773, 3 ships carrying tea arrived in Boston. The colonists refused to upload and accept the tea. The royal governor of Massachusetts refused to allow the ships to return to Great Britain with the tea. So, on the evening of December 16th, disguised colonists ended the stalemate is like a standoff, by boarding the ships and dumping the tea overboard, and the event became known as the Boston Tea Party. The issue of taxes created an ever-widening split between the Great Britain and the American colonies, and this eventually leads to the Revolutionary War and the formation of the new United States. We're on the eve of the war, but I do want to talk about the Tea Party today and the Quartering Act. It eventually led, I read that. For colonists, for those of you, I'm right here. For the colonists, the dispute was not about the cost of taxes. It was about being taxed without having representative in Parliament to voice their concerns. And this is going to become a big part of the new Constitution that we create in a few years. Deciding what goods and services should be taxed and how revenues, money from taxes should be spent remain important topics of conversation and debate for even Americans today. All right, there we go. All right, this is where you need your paper and pencil. The British need a place to house their soldiers, and they passed a law requiring colonists to provide shelter and food for their soldiers, the Quartering Act. What are you going to do? Are you A, gladly offer your house and food for those young men for home who are protecting you and your family with Indian raids? Or, what? You don't want the soldiers in your town, much less in your own house. You'd rather go to jail than house some of those lobster backs. And by the way, lobster backs, that was considered a swear word back in the day if you called someone a lobster back. Now, think about this, and you should have your pencil and paper with you here too. This man, Paul Revere, he had a lot of kids, and that really afforded him the opportunity to not have British soldiers quarter with him or stay with him or board with him for free, which allowed him to participate in a lot of underground treasonous activities. So think about this. The more kids or more family members you have living in your house, chances are the British are not going to want to quarter in your house. So what are you going to do? A or B? And don't forget, please make sure you are writing down your responses right now on a piece of paper, because you're going to have to answer something else. Now, there's another act going on, the Tea Act. I don't know about you, but I really like tea. Right here we have the London headquarters of the East India Company. Oops, it turns out I should probably check my pencil first. All right, so here, it's a beautiful secondary resource. It's a painting, it's lovely. So what are you gonna do? Are you going to A, pay the tax because you love your tea, and if you have to pay a little more for it, so be it. You don't mind paying that tax. A, pay your tax, or are you going to boycott it, meaning that you're not going to purchase it, you're going to avoid it altogether. Maybe you want to smuggle it, I don't know, but that's treasonous. You never really liked tea anyway, and now is a good time to try coffee. So what are you going to do? Are you going to, or B, boycott it? You've made some big decisions on what you want to do in terms of your boycotting the tea or boycotting the Quartering Act or participating in the Quartering Act or paying your taxes. But as a colonist, you know things are heating up some more. Some Bostonians had a tea party and dumped a shipload of British tea into the Boston harbor. The British government is furious and passed a series of laws colonists are calling the Intolerable Acts. A few months later, you've been invited to join a Continental Congress of Colonial Representatives meeting in Philadelphia to discuss everything that's been going on. Do you go? Yes, you're going to go, but only to be a voice of reason and make sure nothing crazy happens. Or B, yes, finally, you have a chance to convince the British to make some real changes. Do you hold the key to our future? What happens now? Where do we go? Are the British going to be reasonable? I don't know where to go from here. Oh, wait, maybe you do. I need you to go to Flipgrid.